you! Stop! Hands where I can see them now!
Sir, I'm doing CPR. She's in cardiac arrest.
I said hands!
I'm
now!
a paramedic. She will die if I stop, please.
You got 3 seconds.
Then arrest me. I'm not letting her die.
At exactly 9:23 on a humid Thursday evening in southeast Atlanta, Georgia, a medical emergency that should have been a routine cardiac call became one of the most disturbing and heartbreaking scenes ever captured on law enforcement body camera footage. The call was simple. A 67-year-old woman had collapsed in her front yard. Her heart had stopped. Every second mattered. And the paramedics who responded were trained, credentialed, and doing everything exactly right. Then a police officer arrived. What followed over the next 22 minutes would be watched by over 63 million people across every social media platform on Earth. It would be broadcast on every major news network. It would be debated in Congress. It would be used as training material in civil rights law schools. And it would ultimately result in a $12 million civil rights settlement that sent shockwaves through the entire country. But before we get to the settlement, before we get to the firing, before we get to the moment an entire city demanded accountability, you need to understand who Darius Coleman was. You need to understand what he was doing that night. And you need to understand exactly what Officer Brett Hargrove decided to do about it. Before we continue, do me a favor, drop a comment right now and tell me where you are watching from. And if you have not already subscribed, please do it right now. This story is going to make you feel things, and you do not want to miss where it goes. Darius Lamont Coleman was not your average 29-year-old. While most people his age were figuring out their career path or scrolling through their phones, Darius Coleman had already dedicated nearly a decade of his life to one single purpose: saving people who were dying. Darius grew up in Vine City, one of the toughest neighborhoods in Atlanta. He watched his grandmother collapse from a heart attack in their kitchen when he was 14 years old. The ambulance took 11 minutes to arrive. She survived, barely. But Darius never forgot standing in that kitchen, completely helpless, watching the woman who raised him fight for her life on the floor while he could do nothing. He made a decision that day. He would never be helpless again, and he would never let someone else feel that way either. By the time he was 19, Darius was a certified emergency medical technician. By 22, he had completed his full paramedic licensure, graduating at the top of his class from Georgia State's EMS program. By 25, he was one of the most decorated paramedics in Atlanta Metro Emergency Services history, having received the department's life-saving commendation 3 separate times. 3 times in 4 years. He had resuscitated cardiac arrest patients that other paramedics had written off. He had stayed on scene longer than required because leaving felt wrong. He had shown up to the hospital days later, on his own time and on his own dime, to check on patients he had brought in. His supervisor, a 20-year EMS veteran named Captain Diane Okafor, described Darius in one word: irreplaceable. He was also, by every account of everyone who knew him, one of the most calm and professional human beings they had ever encountered. His partner, Jamie Reyes, a 4-year paramedic who had worked alongside Darius for 2 full years, described his bedside manner as almost supernatural. She said he had the ability to make a dying person feel safe. That was a gift, and on the night of October 9th, that gift was being fully deployed when everything went wrong. On the evening of October 9th, Darius and Jamie were already 11 hours into a 12-hour shift. It had been a hard shift. 3 calls before lunch, a bad car accident on I-285 in the early afternoon, a pediatric breathing emergency at 6 in the evening that both of them were still quietly recovering from emotionally. They were tired. The kind of tired that only emergency medical workers understand. The kind of tired that lives in your bones. But they were still fully present, still locked in, because that is what the job demands. At 9:17 p.m., the call came through. 67-year-old female, unresponsive, not breathing, in the front yard of a residential home on Melrose Drive in southeast Atlanta. Possible cardiac arrest. Darius and Jamie had the rig moving in under 30 seconds. The neighborhood was quiet that night, the kind of quiet that southeast Atlanta gets just after sunset when the heat finally breaks and people start coming out to sit on their porches. The ambulance pulled onto Melrose Drive at 9:23 p.m. The exterior ambulance cameras, which ran continuously, captured everything from that moment forward. Ms. Eleanor Hayes was lying on her back in the front yard of her modest brick home. Her neighbor, a man named Gerald Porter, was kneeling beside her, visibly panicking. 2 other neighbors stood near the fence, hands over their mouths. Ms. Hayes had no pulse. She was not breathing. She had been down for an estimated 4 minutes. Darius and Jamie hit the ground running. Darius had his gloves on before his feet touched the grass. He knelt beside Ms. Hayes, checked her airway, checked her pulse, found nothing, and began chest compressions immediately. Hard, fast, rhythmic compressions, the way only someone with real muscle memory can deliver. Jamie positioned the AED and called out vitals to dispatch. They were a machine, a perfectly synchronized, perfectly trained machine working to pull a woman back from the edge of death. Darius was counting compressions under his breath. He was sweating through his uniform. His arms were burning, but he did not stop. He would not stop. Because 4 years earlier, he had watched a man die on a sidewalk in Buckhead while a crowd stood around helplessly, and he had told himself then that he would never, ever stop as long as there was a chance. And then the patrol car pulled up. Officer Brett Hargrove had been with the Atlanta Police Department for 11 years. He was assigned to the Southeast Precinct and had a reputation among his colleagues for being what they called assertive. That was the polite word. His personnel file, which would later become a central piece of evidence, told a more complicated story. But we will get to that. Hargrove stepped out of his cruiser and walked toward the scene. His body camera was recording. He saw 2 paramedics working on a patient in the grass. He saw neighbors standing nearby. And then he focused on Darius. What happened next has been analyzed by law enforcement experts, civil rights attorneys, former police chiefs, and behavioral psychologists. The consensus has been remarkably consistent. There was no logical reason for what Hargrove did next. None. "Hey," Hargrove said, his voice loud and cutting across the sound of compressions. "Hey, stop what you are doing and show me your hands." Darius did not stop compressions. He did not look up. He could not. He said, "Sir, I am performing CPR on a cardiac arrest patient. She is dying right now." Hargrove took 2 steps closer. His body camera captured every frame. "I said hands. Now." Darius, still compressing, said, "I am a paramedic. This woman will die if I stop. Please, I have my badge right here on my chest." His Atlanta Metro EMS badge was clearly visible, attached to the left side of his uniform, exactly where protocol required it. His name tag was visible. His uniform was clearly marked. The ambulance was parked 6 feet away with every light on. This was not ambiguous. This was not confusing. Hargrove did not acknowledge any of it. "You got 3 seconds before I put you on the ground," he said. Jamie Reyes had stopped what she was doing. She stepped toward Hargrove and said, "Officer, we are on an active medical call. This man is a licensed paramedic. We have a patient in cardiac arrest. Please, we need you to stand back." Hargrove did not look at Jamie. He kept his eyes on Darius. "Then you are going to have to arrest me," Darius said, his voice cracking but steady, "because I am not letting this woman die." And that is when Brett Hargrove reached down and grabbed Darius Coleman by the arm. Now let me pause here because I need you to really absorb what is happening in this footage. There is a 67-year-old woman on the ground. Her heart is not beating. There is a uniformed paramedic with an active medical badge performing life-saving compressions on her body. There is another uniformed paramedic standing right there. The ambulance is lit up like a Christmas tree, and a police officer with 11 years of experience is physically pulling the man performing CPR away from the dying patient. The body camera shows Darius being pulled to his feet. You can hear him saying, "Please, please, she will die," over and over, not in anger, not with aggression, with desperation. The desperation of a man who knows exactly what happens to a cardiac arrest patient when compressions stop. Hargrove pulled Darius's hands behind his back and cuffed him. The compressions stopped for 41 seconds. 41 seconds? Jamie scrambled back to Ms. Hayes and took over. Her hands were shaking. You can see it in the footage, but she locked in and started compressions again. 41 seconds without compressions on a cardiac arrest patient can mean the difference between recovery and permanent brain damage. It can mean the difference between life and death. Darius stood handcuffed on the grass of a stranger's front yard, watching his partner fight alone to save a life he had been saving 30 seconds ago. Neighbors were recording on their phones. Multiple people were shouting at Hargrove. One neighbor, Gerald Porter, the same man who had been kneeling by Ms. Hayes when the ambulance arrived, stepped forward and said what every single person there was thinking. "What is wrong with you? He is a paramedic. What is wrong with you?" Hargrove told the crowd to step back. For the next 18 minutes, while Jamie worked alone, while backup paramedics were called from another unit to assist, while Ms. Eleanor Hayes lay in the grass of her own front yard with her life hanging by a thread, Darius Coleman stood in handcuffs by the side of the patrol car, his badge visible, his uniform unmistakable, his record spotless. Quick question for everyone watching. At what point in that footage do you think Hargrove realized he had made a mistake? Because the body camera captured his face for the entire 18 minutes. Drop your answer in the comments. I want to know what you think. Ms. Hayes was eventually stabilized on scene. She was transported to Grady Memorial Hospital in critical condition. She survived, but her attending physician would later state in a sworn declaration that the 41-second interruption in compressions had materially worsened her outcome and contributed to a level of cognitive impairment she would carry for the rest of her life. Darius was placed in the back of the patrol car. He did not resist. He did not argue. He sat in silence, his wrists cuffed behind him, and stared out the window. He was taken to the Southeast Precinct, processed, and released 4 hours later on a citation for obstruction. Obstruction. A man performing CPR on a dying woman. Obstruction. When Darius walked out of that precinct at 1:47 in the morning, he had already made a decision. He was not going to let this go. Not for himself. Not just for himself anyway. He was going to let this go for every paramedic, every doctor, every first responder, every black professional who had ever had their credentials ignored, their expertise dismissed, and their authority questioned because of the color of their skin. He called his attorney, Ronald Bates, at 7 the following morning. Bates was a civil rights attorney based in Atlanta with 22 years of experience in police misconduct litigation. When Darius described what had happened, Bates was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Do not talk to anyone. Do not post anything on social media. And do not go back to work until we have spoken in person." By 9 a.m., Bates had formally requested copies of all body camera footage, the ambulance exterior camera footage, the dispatch recordings, and Hargrove's full personnel file under Georgia's Open Records Act. What they received changed everything. The body camera footage was exactly as described, every second of it, but it was Hargrove's personnel file that turned this from a misconduct complaint into a civil rights case. In 11 years with the Atlanta Police Department, Hargrove had accumulated 9 formal complaints. 7 of those 9 complaints involved black male civilians. In 4 of those complaints, the word racial bias appeared explicitly in the complainant's written statement. All 4 of those complaints had been reviewed and cleared by Internal Affairs without any disciplinary action. None of this had ever been made public. None of it had ever appeared in his performance evaluations, and none of it had ever slowed down his career. Bates filed a formal complaint with the Atlanta Police Department's Office of Professional Standards on October 11th, just 2 days after the incident. But this was not a routine complaint form filled out in a lobby. This was a 47-page documented submission that included a legal analysis of 4th and 14th Amendment violations, a frame-by-frame breakdown of every relevant moment of body camera footage, sworn witness statements from Jamie Reyes and 3 neighbors, a medical declaration from Ms. Hayes' attending physician, and a complete annotated copy of Hargrove's personnel file, cross-referenced with the applicable incident dates. The Office of Professional Standards, which typically takes 6 to 8 weeks to even acknowledge a complaint, sent a formal response within 5 business days. Captain Sandra Mitchell was assigned as the lead investigator. In a department known for slow-walking misconduct cases, her pace was notable. By October 24th, just 15 days after the incident, Hargrove had been placed on administrative leave pending investigation. That alone was unusual. Career officers in major city departments are rarely placed on leave that quickly. But the evidence was not ambiguous, and the department's legal team had already read the 47-page filing. They understood what was coming. Do you think the department moved fast enough? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Captain Mitchell pulled every camera. She reviewed Hargrove's body camera footage in its entirety 7 times. She reviewed the ambulance exterior footage. She reviewed bystander cell phone footage uploaded to social media, of which there were 4 separate recordings from different angles. She requested and reviewed the full dispatch audio. She interviewed Jamie Reyes for 3 hours. She interviewed Gerald Porter and 2 other neighbors. She interviewed the backup paramedics who arrived on scene. And she obtained a written declaration from Ms. Hayes' neurologist, who detailed the specific medical consequences of the 41-second interruption in compressions. The investigation confirmed 4 specific violations of department policy. Hargrove had interfered with an active medical emergency without lawful justification. He had failed to verify or acknowledge clearly visible emergency medical credentials. He had used physical force against an individual who posed no threat and was engaged in a lawful and medically necessary activity, and he had made an arrest without probable cause. But there was something else in the footage that Mitchell said made the case even more serious. In the body camera recording, approximately 90 seconds before approaching Darius, Hargrove can be heard making a comment into his radio to another officer. The audio, enhanced by the department's forensic lab, captured him saying the words, "Got a situation here." blackmail, not complying. The body camera footage at that moment clearly shows Darius kneeling in the grass performing compressions, his uniform fully visible, the ambulance lit up behind him. He was not failing to comply, he was saving a life. And the first thing Hargrove communicated to another officer was not that there was a medical emergency, or that paramedics were on scene. It was the race of the man performing CPR. The footage was officially obtained through an Open Records Act request filed by a local news station on October 29th. The city attempted to delay release, citing an ongoing investigation. Bates challenged that delay in court. On November 4th, a Fulton County judge ordered the footage released within 48 hours. It hit the internet on November 6th at approximately 3 in the afternoon. By midnight, it had been viewed 41 million times. By the following morning, it was the top trending video in the United States on every major platform. Every major news network ran the footage in its entirety during prime time. 2 sitting United States senators issued formal statements. The Georgia governor's office released a statement calling the footage disturbing and promising a review of statewide EMS interaction protocols. 3 members of the Atlanta City Council called for Hargrove's immediate termination. Medical professionals responded with particular fury. The American College of Emergency Physicians released a public statement. The National Association of Emergency Medical Technicians released a second one. Doctors and nurses and paramedics from across the country recorded themselves in uniform, holding signs that said, "Let us save lives." The hashtag became one of the most used in Twitter's history in a 48-hour period. Some people pushed back. There were commenters online who said Darius should have cooperated faster, that he should have just stopped compressions for a moment and explained himself calmly, that the officer could not have known for certain. Those arguments were addressed directly by every medical professional who weighed in. Stopping CPR to explain yourself is not protocol. It is never protocol, because the 4 minutes without oxygen that precede and follow a cardiac arrest are not pause and resume moments. They are the difference between a patient who walks out of a hospital and a patient who does not. As for the argument that the officer genuinely did not know who Darius was, the footage answered that directly and completely. The badge was visible. The uniform was visible. The ambulance was visible. Jamie had verbally identified them both. Gerald Porter had shouted it from 15 feet away. There was no ambiguity. None. Darius himself said very little publicly in the initial weeks. His attorney advised caution during the investigation. But in one brief statement released through his attorney's office on November 9th, Darius said this: "I was not a black man resisting an officer that night. I was a paramedic doing my job. Ms. Hayes needed me to stay focused, and I stayed focused. That is what I was trained to do. I just hope she knows I never stopped fighting for her." The internal investigation concluded on December 15th, 67 days after the incident. The findings were released in a 12-page official report. The department determined that Hargrove had violated 4 separate department policies, that his conduct had endangered the life of a civilian, that his arrest of Darius Coleman lacked probable cause and violated the 4th Amendment of the United States Constitution, and that the audio evidence suggested the decision to engage was influenced by racial bias. The department recommended termination. Chief William Dunbar accepted the recommendation the same day the report was released. Hargrove was terminated effective immediately. His 11-year career with the Atlanta Police Department ended because of 22 minutes on a Thursday night in October. On February 3rd of the following year, the city of Atlanta entered into a civil settlement agreement with Darius Coleman. The city did not admit wrongdoing as part of the settlement, which is standard legal language in these cases, but the number they agreed to pay was not standard at all: $12 million. It was the largest civil rights settlement in Atlanta City history involving a law enforcement misconduct claim. Attorney Bates stated at the press conference that the settlement reflected not just what happened to Darius Coleman, but what had been allowed to build over 11 years without consequence. He said, 7 complaints. 4 of them explicitly citing racial bias. All of them cleared. This did not start with Ms. Hayes' front yard. It started long before that. And it continued because systems failed. Following the settlement and Hargrove's termination, the Atlanta Police Department announced several policy changes. The department implemented mandatory emergency medical services recognition training for all active officers, requiring them to complete a certified 4-hour course on identifying credentialed medical personnel and appropriate scene protocol when EMS is present. The department created a new review threshold, requiring any complaint citing racial bias to be reviewed by a 3-person panel rather than a single internal affairs officer. All body camera footage from incidents resulting in a civilian complaint would now be preserved for a minimum of 5 years rather than the previous 2. And the department partnered with Atlanta Metro Emergency Services to develop a joint protocol document governing law enforcement and EMS interactions at shared scenes. Essentially, the Atlanta Police Department made its officers take the kind of training that Darius Coleman could have taught them years earlier. After the footage went viral, 4 other individuals came forward with complaints about Hargrove from incidents spanning the previous 3 years. A black male nurse who said Hargrove had demanded he remove his hospital badge lanyard and identify himself during a welfare check on a neighbor. A black male firefighter who said Hargrove had questioned his presence at a residential fire scene, despite his full uniform and department gear being clearly visible. 2 black male residents of Southeast Atlanta who described separate incidents of being stopped, questioned, and detained without any stated cause. None of their complaints had moved past the initial review stage. This raises a question that this department, and departments across the country, have to answer honestly. How many Brett Hargroves are still out there? How many personnel files with 7 complaints and 0 consequences are sitting in filing cabinets right now? As of today, Darius Lamont Coleman is still a paramedic with Atlanta Metro Emergency Services. He never left. He took 2 weeks off after the incident, not because he wanted to, but because his supervisor, Captain Okafor, made him. She said he needed to breathe. He came back to the same unit, the same shift, and the same partner. Jamie Reyes requested to remain paired with him, and the department honored that request without hesitation. He has since become one of the most requested speakers in the country on the topic of civil rights, EMS professional recognition, and racial bias in emergency response environments. He has spoken at the National EMS Leadership Conference twice. He has been invited to address medical and law enforcement audiences in 14 states. He sits on a newly formed state advisory board in Georgia focused on emergency responder civil rights protections. Ms. Eleanor Hayes, the 67-year-old woman on whose behalf Darius refused to stop, attended a press conference in January after the settlement was announced. She walked slowly, with a cane she had not needed before the incident. Her neurologist's declaration had described mild but permanent cognitive changes consistent with the oxygen interruption during those 41 seconds. But she was standing, she was alive, and when she saw Darius across the room, she crossed to him, took both of his hands in hers, and said nothing for a long moment. Then she said, "You stayed. You stayed for me. Brett Hargrove is no longer in law enforcement. He has not made public statements since his termination." Here's a question I want you to sit with. If you were Darius Coleman in that moment, handcuffed in the grass while a woman you were saving lay 6 feet away, would you have been able to hold it together the way he did? Comment below. I genuinely want to know. Because here is the bigger picture, and it matters more than any one case. This story is not just about one night in Southeast Atlanta. It is about the invisible tax that Black professionals pay every single day in this country when they show up to work. It is about the way a badge, a uniform, and a credential that would be instantly recognized and respected on someone else's body gets questioned, ignored, and treated as suspicious when it is worn on a black man's chest. It is about the gap between who the system says it protects and who it actually protects in the critical moments when protection is most needed. Most people do not realize that there are no federal laws requiring law enforcement officers to complete specific training on recognizing emergency medical credentials. That gap exists in the vast majority of states, and some officers, whether consciously or through trained habit, count on the assumption that the person in front of them will not know that gap exists. They count on compliance driven by fear. They count on the power imbalance holding. But when you encounter someone like Darius Coleman, someone who was not just trained to perform life-saving medicine, but who had made a quiet personal promise to a 14-year-old version of himself, standing in a kitchen in Vine City, the power imbalance does not hold the way it usually does. Not because Darius raised his voice, not because he resisted physically, but because he simply refused to stop doing what was right. The handcuffs did not stop him from being a paramedic. They just changed which hands were holding Ms. Hayes' chest. There is something that needs to be addressed directly because it came up constantly in the comments and coverage when this story broke. Some people said Darius should have just complied for 30 seconds, explained himself, and then gone back to the patient. They said that de-escalation goes both ways. They said that in the heat of the moment, even a well-meaning officer might be confused. Here is the response to that, and it comes directly from emergency medicine protocol. You do not stop CPR to have a conversation. You do not pause chest compressions to negotiate. Every second of interrupted compressions reduces the probability of survival. The American Heart Association guidelines are explicit and non-negotiable on this point. Darius was not being difficult. He was following the only protocol that gave Ms. Hayes a chance. As for the argument that the officer could not have known who he was dealing with, the footage eliminated that argument entirely within the first 20 seconds. The confusion defense only works if there was something to be confused about. There was not. Yes, there is a real and documented reality that asserting your rights during a law enforcement encounter can escalate danger, particularly for black men in America. Darius knew that risk. He was not unaware of it. He calculated it in real time, and he decided that Ms. Eleanor Hayes was worth the calculation. That is not recklessness. That is a level of moral clarity that most people will never be called upon to demonstrate. The fact that choosing to save a life while wearing a uniform and displaying a badge could result in handcuffs tells you everything you need to know about the problem. So what should you actually take away from Darius Coleman's story? The first lesson is that documentation is everything. Darius's attorney built a 47-page filing because everything was on camera. In a world where body cameras, dash cams, and cell phones are everywhere, the best protection you have is a record of exactly what happened. If you are a first responder, a medical professional, or anyone in an environment where your authority or credentials might be questioned, make sure your credentials are visible, your communications are clear, and whenever legally possible, that there is a record. The second lesson is that accountability requires pressure. This case moved as quickly as it did not because the system worked as designed, but because the evidence was undeniable, the public attention was enormous, and an attorney who knew exactly what he was doing turned a complaint into a legal document that was impossible to ignore. Accountability does not happen on its own. It happens when the cost of inaction becomes higher than the cost of acting. The third lesson is that professional knowledge is power. Darius did not shout. He did not threaten. He did not lose control. He stated facts in precise, calm language while performing a medical procedure under extraordinary pressure. The composure he maintained was not passive, it was strategic. Knowing what you are doing and being able to articulate it clearly under pressure is one of the most powerful tools any person can have in a confrontational situation. The fourth lesson is about patterns. 7 complaints. 4 citing racial bias. All cleared. Brett Hargrove was not an isolated incident. He was a pattern, and patterns only end when someone refuses to be one more data point in them. Darius refused. The fifth lesson, and perhaps the most important, is about staying human. In the worst moment of a terrible night, with his wrists behind his back and a dying woman 6 feet away, Darius Coleman did not give up on Ms. Eleanor Hayes. He kept asking his partner to keep going. He kept his voice directed at the work, not at the injustice, because he understood in that moment, and in every moment since, that the work is bigger than the moment. One man, one night, 22 minutes, and a woman who is alive because he refused to stop. That is the power of purpose over panic. That is the importance of knowing who you are when the world tells you that you are something lesser. That is what happens when a 14-year-old boy who stood helpless in a kitchen in Vine City grows up and decides that helpless is never going to be the word that defines him. Final question for you. What is one thing you learned from this story that you did not know before? Drop it in the comments right now. And if this story moved you, please share it. Not for the channel. Share it because stories like this deserve to travel. This story matters because it is not just about Darius Coleman and Brett Hargrove. It is about every black professional who has walked into a room where their credentials were questioned before they could speak. It is about every first responder who has had to prove they belong at the scene of an emergency they were called to. It is about every system that quietly clears complaints until a 47-page filing makes quiet clearing impossible. It is about every patient who has no idea that the person fighting for their life had to fight through something else entirely just to stay by their side. Darius Coleman's story shows that you can stay calm when the world is telling you to panic. You can hold the line when someone with authority is trying to move you off it. You can choose the person who needs you over the confrontation that wants you. And sometimes you can win. Not every story ends this way. Not every night like that. October night ends with a settlement and a policy change and a standing ovation at a national conference. Not every complaint leads to accountability. Not every camera captures what needs to be captured at exactly the right moment. But this one did. And because it did, training protocols changed, policies changed, and somewhere in Atlanta, right now, an officer who went through that new EMS recognition course is making a different decision than Brett Hargrove made. That is Darius Coleman's legacy. Not the $12 million, though that matters. Not the termination, though that matters too. His legacy is the 41-second number that is now cited in every single EMS law enforcement joint training in the state of Georgia. His legacy is Ms. Hayes walking slowly with her cane into a room and saying, "You stayed." This is the story of a racist cop who arrested a black male paramedic during a live rescue. But more than that, it is a story about what one person's refusal to stop can change. Subscribe for more real stories about accountability, civil rights, and the people who stand their ground when it costs them everything. Smash that like button if you believe that no badge and no bias should ever stand between a patient and the person trying to save their life. Share this video, drop a comment, and we will see you in the next one.